Good morning. Welcome to Hope, Faith, and Joy Daily Devotion with me, Pastor Amanda. Happy Friday the 13th. Can you believe it? But yeah, it's Friday the 13th today, but that doesn't stop us from diving into chapter 6 of Genesis today. And if you have a mindset for the extraordinary, that is what we get today in chapter 6. So what we discover is that, we had the genealogy yesterday, and it ended with us learning about Noah, who had 3 sons. And so now we know that the world is populating, so to speak, and what happens is it says that the sons of God saw all this humanity and that they were fair, and they started taking wives for themselves. And so there's different ways of looking at this. There is the belief that there was supernatural relationships that were created, like with angels and devils, and there was this kind of commingling of supernatural forces. There's others that have said, well, maybe it was the idea that there were other civilizations, the Canaanites and the Shittites and different communities, and what that was an intermingling of maybe pagans, in a sense, at this point in time. And so you have to say, well, what is it? But remember, the Hebrew people were storytellers, and they were bringing meaning to what was going on in their world. And these stories might have a little bit of fact and a little bit of fiction, just like the fishing story about how big was that fish when you went fishing. And so we have to remember that they were excellent storytellers. And so we, as the reader, have to find what's the meaning and the point of this story, and dig out what's helpful to us in discovering meaning for ourselves. And so that's kind of your teacher moment for this morning. And so we find that there's this intermingling, but what happens in the process is that instead of goodness growing, wickedness begins to take over the earth. And we do have this wonderful line that a lot of people like to dig into. It's the line, verse 4 of chapter 6. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and bore children to them. And so this is one of those supernatural beings that we actually have named in our Bible. But we have to also remember, at the time that this was being taught, that was the understanding of the culture at the time. And so, the Egyptian pharaohs were actually believed to be sons of the gods and to be gods themselves. And so recognizing that that's the culture they were living in. And so it's perfectly normal for them to have this happen. And yet, what we find then still, though, we have these super big human beings, but what happens is, because of God's displeasure with the wickedness, we get the reason that, so God needs to blot out the earth, and what's going to happen is then also God limits the amount of time that man can live on the earth. So what we're going to see is that, God's like, I'm sorry, I created these humans, but I've got to limit their time. They're living too long, and they're just getting more wicked. And so God decides to blot out the earth. So we see God's judgment coming out. But what we also see at the same time is God's mercy. God's recognizing that there's someone good still there. In the midst of his creation, he still sees goodness. And so we find out, verse 8, that Noah found favor in the sight of God. I think this is kind of one of those good moments to remember that when it feels like the world around us is crumbling and everything's bad, that God can still see our hearts in the midst. And are you going to follow off and be like the wicked just because that's what everybody else is doing? Or going to have that boldness of character to stick with the God you know? And so we see that. And so Noah still continue, even though the rest of the world is going off doing their own thing, Noah stays faithful to God. And so God decides to that he's going to wipe it out. So he talks to Noah. And he actually gives measurements and all that stuff. But I think that's just to help it give it some truth there, that what was going on here. But what I really think is interesting is we have, for the very first time, a kind of a new important word pops up in verse 18. But I will establish my covenant with you. Now this is important because if we realize Adam and Eve did not have a covenant. They had rules. I mean, kind of like guidelines. They weren't written down. They were spoken rules. Do this, don't do this, and the rest is yours. They kind of had this free reign of overdoing everything. Just don't do this like one thing. But God's like, okay, that didn't work out. Look what happened. So now we have for the first time a covenant. And this first covenant's pretty basic, but it's, if you do this, I'm going to do this for you. And here's some instructions. And so there's this sense that like God and humans are going to have these rules to follow with each other. And it's not as deep yet as we're going to find out like in Exodus about the 10 Commandments and all that. But it's a very basic, I'll establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And you're going to bring in 2 of every kind of animal. You're going to bring in food. And then I will then take care of you, but destroy the world. And what we find too, though, that was important is that Noah obeyed. He followed through with his part of the covenant so that God could do God's part of the covenant. And so we see this development of what a human's relationship is with God, the Creator. And we're developing what that's going to look like. And our Bible tells us sometimes more about what doesn't work than what does work. And we're going to learn a lot about what goes on here. And so recognizing that God is also, God knows everything, but God learns along the way too with us, but just God's greater than us. And so we just see this development happening. And I hope that today, if anything, if you feel like the world is just a mess all around you, Noah's faithfulness gives us courage that if we're faithful, God will watch over us. And the wickedness might be around us, but God is with us. God sees our hearts, and God's ready to protect us. But we still have a covenant that we know we need to live in the Word. We need to have our prayer lives. We need to behave as Jesus has taught us so that we're living into this covenant. But remember, our covenant's written on our hearts now. Like Jesus gave that. And so that's our hope. That's where our faith comes in. That's where our joy is. And so I thank you for joining me today. I hope you got a little something out of this. And I will see you Monday as we continue on with the Great Flood. All right. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.